Imagine you are a woman living in England in 1830, not in a Dickens novel, but in a reality so cold and harsh that there is no room for daydreaming. You stand huddled in a Yorkshire square in the early morning, your breath turning to white mist, your feet numb with frost. And the strangest thing is not the biting cold, but the rope tightening gently around your neck. It is not a cattle drive, though it looks like one. It is a symbol, a living deed that binds you to the man holding the other end. The man who used to be your husband and who is now selling you like a healthy calving plowing cow. The crowd gathers not because they care about you, but because this is the only entertainment in a dark countryside, watching a woman being auctioned off in the market. There was a strange mixture of curiosity, contempt, and calculation in their eyes. The men in the crowd made no secret of examining you like a stallion, whether you had all your teeth, whether your hands were calloused, whether you could bear children, whether you could wash, mend, obey. And you just stood there, trying to keep your back straight, not crying, not begging, because you knew that the greatest tragedy was not being sold, but being stuck with the man who was selling you. Because in this strange world, where the law did not consider you a human being being bought by someone else, was the only way you could start over, even if it meant starting from the bottom. This is not a clandestine illegal human trafficking as we often think. No, it is public, organized in broad daylight, witnessed and followed a process that resembles a cruel festival of injustice. No police come to stop it. No one calls it a crime. Because in the world you live in, a wife has no legal rights, no property rights, no right to sue her husband even if she is beaten to the point of breaking her bones. The act of selling your wife in the market is considered the most civilized way to get a divorce. What is most horrifying is not the sight of the woman being led along like a cow, but the indifference of all those who witnessed it. The silence of the law, the complicity of the community, and the silence that the woman was forced to swallow, all create a picture that we think only exists in nightmares. But it is real. It has happened, many times, in the country that once called itself the most civilized in the world. And so, wives are sold, not because they are bad wives, but because they have no way out. Men sell their wives, not because they are cruel, but because society has deprived them of any means of resolving a failed marriage other than turning it into a market. And the crowd, the buyers, the onlookers, are not necessarily evil. They are simply products of an inhuman system where a woman's freedom costs her dignity, and her only hope is that her new master will be less evil than her last. This opening scene is more than a terrifying spectacle to lure viewers. It is a window into an entire era where women had no name, no rights, no voice except for the bidding war cry of their ex-husbands. And it was from that silence that some dared to use the sound of the auctioneer's hammer as their final declaration. I want to live, even if it meant being sold. If you were born a woman in early 19th century England, you might have had some freedom as a single woman. You could sign contracts, own property, even sue in some cases. You could put a small plot of land in your own name, open a bakery, collect wages from your labor, and keep the rewards for yourself. But all of that would disappear the moment you said your vows before God and the law when you became someone's wife. With a marriage vow, you surrender not only your heart, but also your legal identity, your property rights, and your very body. The law of coverture, a word that sounds gentle but is quietly destructive, has swallowed up every legal trace of a woman. The covered wife, as the lawyer William Blackstone wrote, disappears from the law, melting like an invisible cloak into the legal person of her husband. You are no longer you. All your rights, all your obligations, all your responsibilities, even your husband's wrongs, can be cast over you as if you were one. But in reality, only one person exists legally, and that person is the man. Imagine a woman named Mary, a typical working-class woman in the 1820s. Before marriage, she was a powerful individual, but after marriage, everything that belonged to her became his. Her wages from laundry, her mother's year-end gift, her vegetable garden, even the dress she wore. If her husband, let's call him William, beat her until she couldn't stand up, the law called it the right to correct his wife. If he drank himself to the point of running out of money, went out with women, and brought home an illness she couldn't report him, the law said he was the head of the household, the one who had the right to manage the household. And if Mary got bored, wanted to leave, wanted to live differently, wanted to be with someone better, the law wouldn't let her, because divorce was the privilege of the rich. Before 1857, to get a divorce, you had to have a personal act passed by Parliament, which cost around $1,000 more than $100,000 today. That's money a working-class woman wouldn't earn in her entire life. After 1857, there was some improvement. The Matrimonial Causes Act allowed divorce through the civil courts, but the cost was still prohibitive, about $40, equivalent to a year's wages for the average working man, not to mention the time, the paperwork, and the social stigma that accompanied it. In other words, divorce was not for people like Mary. And when the law closed the door, people had to invent their own way out, however painful and humiliating. That's when the wife markets became the false legal door, deformed but functional for Mary and hundreds of other women to get a second chance. It's strange that you have to be treated like property to have the right to choose your own life. But that's the paradox of a society where the law exists not to protect people, but to protect the power structure. And in that structure, women, no matter how gentle or strong, are just a name that is erased the moment they cross the threshold of marriage. From a modern perspective, we may think that it is barbaric, but for them, the Marys, the Elizabeths, the unnamed Sarahs, it was reality. And in the thick shadow of the law, at that time sometimes just a small ray of light, even a public sale in the market, was enough for them to bet everything in exchange for a little freedom, a little right to be themselves. In a world where women do not exist in the eyes of the law, where marriage is not a voluntary contract, but a lifelong sentence, trying to escape an unhappy marriage is like trying to escape a prison without doors. But even prisons have escape routes. Here, working-class women have only 5 options, if we can call them options, to free themselves from their miserable marriages. And the irony is that of those 5 exits, only one of them truly opens the door to freedom. The rest are dead ends, or led straight to tragedy. The first way the two people can voluntarily break up. But this is like a farewell without papers, without guarantees, without legal value. Even though they are far apart, both are still bound by the law. They cannot remarry. They are not recognized as single. They cannot legally start their life over with someone else. The new relationship, if any, will be considered adultery, and the woman is always the one who is punished. The second way, the wife can disappear. One day she leaves, the cold house walks away without looking back, leaving everything behind, including the children. That is the only way to escape if she has no money, no lawyer, no one to defend her. But the risks are unpredictable. If discovered, she can be arrested. Fine sent back to live with her abusive husband like an object that cannot be discarded. The third way, file for divorce in an ecclesiastical court. But that requires proving adultery or assault with a life-threatening degree. And no one is going to be able to photograph evidence easily in a house where it all happened behind closed doors. Not to mention the staggering costs, lawyers filing fees, court time, and the ridicule of a society that views divorce as shameful. The fourth way, wait for death to come. This is the most silent, the most brutal, and also the most realistic way out for thousands of wives who have nothing left to hope for. A death from disease, from hunger, from being beaten to the point of being unable to stand up. Many of them do not end their lives, but death comes as an outcome tacitly accepted by the law. Since the wife is only a dependent part of the husband, her disappearance is not worth anyone's concern. And finally, the fifth way, the strangest, most painful, but also the only way that can lead a woman to a new life sold in the market. A form of community divorce, a cruel but effective ritual, a compromise between humiliation and freedom. When all legal doors are locked, the rope around the neck becomes a symbol of choice, a forced choice, but one that carries a glimmer of hope. Even if treated like an animal, even if judged as a commodity, that woman still has the chance to live another life with another person, with a more comfortable status. Maybe. Why is it called hope? Because sometimes the person waiting at the market is not a strange wife buyer, but her dream lover, a kind widow, a man who once helped her, a man she secretly wanted to live with but could not because of the marriage bond. And in the silent agreement between the three people, the husband wants to let go, the wife wants to leave, and the lover wants to start over. The wife auction is no longer a humiliation, but becomes a distorted ritual that allows all three to be free. It is sad to say that in the 19th century, in a country considered a beacon of civilization, the quickest, cheapest, and most legal way to get a divorce was to turn a human being into a commodity in a crowded market. But it is the truth, a truth that cannot be denied and cannot be forgotten. In the shadow of the old law, there were women who accepted to step onto the auction floor like stepping onto the guillotine, not because they were weak, but because they were too strong to endure a life with no way out. And that choice, painful, naked, unjust, became a testament to the desire to live, the desire to be treated as a human being. In the middle of the village square, once used for trading cattle, turnips, and textiles, a strange ritual was being performed as if it were a matter of course. A wife head, bows, hands clasped together, stood silently, a rough rope around her neck, not to bind, but to confirm, not to execute, but to affirm that she was a transferable object, a legitimate commodity in the eyes of the world. The husband or auctioneer began the sale with the usual description. 26 years old, healthy, can sew, can cook, easy to give birth to, still has all her teeth. There was no anger or hatred in the way he spoke. It was just a man doing something that the law did not prohibit, society did not object to, and the community was used to seeing. Perhaps it was this normalization that was the most frightening thing. The buyers, the men crowding around, stepped forward, not hesitating to check her hand, her eyes, or her half-closed lips for any charm. They saw nothing wrong with this. They came to choose a wife like choosing a healthy cow or a housework machine. They did not care about her past. They only cared about how long and how well she could serve them now. But there is something that outsiders do not know, that sometimes the auction is a pre-scripted play. The buyer is not a stranger. Sometimes it is the man she secretly loves, or a kind person who has silently observed her unhappy life. The prices are given as if to complete the procedures. The shyness in her eyes may be real, but behind it is the waiting, the hope of selling to the right person. And when the final price is set, when the rope is handed over, when the crowd nods in approval, it is not only the end of the first marriage, but also the beginning of a second chance, although not officially, but somewhat more humane. But things don't always go according to plan. There are times when the crowd becomes too real. Strangers join in on the sale, outbid overshadowing the original intent. When the man who was supposed to buy her doesn't have enough money, when her ex-husband suddenly feels greedier, when the crowd cheers for a complete stranger, the woman loses control of her fate. Her eyes become colder, harder. It's no longer a release ceremony, it's a real auction, and she's the centerpiece. The rope was not just a decoration, it was evidence. After the market, if anyone asked, if anyone doubted, the husband would say, "I sold her." There were witnesses. There was someone holding the rope. And that was it. No one pursued the matter. No one called it a violation of the body, because simply in the laws of that time, the wife was not a person. She was property. And property could be transferred if there was a claimant and the community agreed. Some sales are even documented. There are signatures. There are witnesses. There is a marriage party after the transaction is completed. The ex-husband drinks, laughs, and sometimes gets a little extra money or a beer. The new husband, if he truly loves her, unties the rope around her neck and says, "From now on, no one will touch you without your permission." The words, while gentle in context, are a huge oath. But despite the nice stories, despite the seemingly happy endings, the basis of the ritual is still cruel. One must be turned into a commodity in order to have a new life. One must stand in the crowd like an animal waiting for auction in order to leave a marriage filled with violence, poverty, and contempt. One must suffer humiliation once, publicly, in order to have the right to choose a second time. No one should have to go through that. No one should have to endure that to be liberated. But for them, the women living in the shadows of the 19th century, it was the path of least evil. And sometimes that liberation came from the rope itself, the thing that was supposed to bind but became a symbol of the desire for freedom. Not every auction is a carefully orchestrated drama where the secret lover bids quietly and the wife smiles behind a veil of shyness. Not every sale ends with a satisfied nod from all three parties. In fact, in many cases, the woman is not chosen, not loved, not defended. She is literally sold to the highest bidder, regardless of who he is, where he comes from, what he carries. If only he has enough money to take her away. There were no affectionate glances, no laughter after the market, no mating parties. There was only a heavy silence, the kind of silence that comes when people know what has happened is wrong, but no one speaks. The woman was dragged away, watched curiously by the crowd. She did not protest, did not cry, but her eyes, the only thing not taken away by the law, said it all. It was not liberation, but another version of captivity, a simple change of ownership. There are husbands who, after selling their wives, sober up and repent, come to beg their wives to return. But once the market is over, the sale is announced, the buyer has taken the rope. There is no turning back. She has been cast into someone else's life, and the unwritten rules of the community consider that the transaction is complete. In a heartbreaking case in 1766, a husband sold his wife in a drunken rage. Then when he sobered up, begged her to return. She refused. He hanged himself shortly afterwards. A tragic ending not because of the wife's cruelty, but because of a society that forced them both onto a path with no way out. And not all women accept it. Some are sold to strangers and then turn around in the middle of the market shouting, "I'm not going anywhere." Some are forced to stand there then, in the middle of the auction, struggling to fly like a bird with a broken wing. But they are few. Most just stand there, brace themselves, hoping for something less terrible than what they left. Even if that is just a new bed, a new name, a way out of the old house. Worse still, children are included in the sale. In one case, a mother was sold with 2 children, as if it were a package deal that the buyer had to consider. The man might accept the burden if he could get a discount or if he felt compassion, which was rare in such markets. And the children, too young to understand what was happening, were dragged along without choice, without a voice following their mother, into a life that was completely alien to them. No one records the pain of the children who were separated from their fathers or left behind. No one records the intermittent cries that followed the end of the market. History records only the number, the place, the price. That a wife was sold for 4 shillings and 2 children each worth a shilling more. No one asks, how did the woman live afterwards? Was the man kind? Did the children go to school? Did they survive the winter? Because when you are the one who is sold after the auction is over, the world turns its back on you. Wife selling without love is not the exception. It is the majority. And in it, no one wins. The husband gets a few coins, but loses a part of his humanity. The buyer gets a wife, but no commitment. The woman is taken away like a commodity. And no one asks if she agrees. Her silence is not consent, but the consequence of having been deprived of a voice for a lifetime. So, when we talk about wife selling as a strange Victorian custom, we should not just see it as a quaint ritual or a historical joke. It was a real pain, a stifled protest, a form of divorce without a signature carried out, with lowered eyes, with eerie silence, and with a society that had long ignored the cries for help of women whose names were not in the law. In every wife-selling market, there are 3 main actors: the seller, the sold, and the buyer. But there is a 4th silent and powerful presence, the crowd. They do not hold the hammer, do not hold the rope, do not spend money to buy the wife. But they are the most important part of the ritual, because without them, there is no witness. Without them, there is no one to legitimize the act with silence or with soft laughter or with tacit nods of agreement. And so, the crowd in the village square, in its unofficial role, becomes a kind of court. There are no robes, no lawyers, but they are the ones who allow the auction to take place in a reasonable, rational, and customary manner. Sometimes the crowd is indifferent. They gather like they are going to a carnival, snacking, gossiping, laughing. For them, this is a form of cheap entertainment, not unlike a traveling circus. But sometimes the crowd also becomes a resistance force, when the person being sold shows resistance, or when the buyer seems suspicious. In one recorded case, a husband was chased away by a crowd for trying to sell his wife to a notorious brute. The villagers would not allow it. They took the rope, returned the wife, and burned the 2 men in effigy in the middle of the village as a warning. As you can see, complicity and resistance are sometimes just a few glances away. The crowd is not necessarily cruel, but it is not innocent either. They have the right to speak up, but they usually choose to remain silent. They can stop, but usually only if they feel offended by the unspoken rules, the strange rules that the community has set up to distinguish between an acceptable wife-selling session and an abuse. For example, if the wife appears to consent, they will silently consent. If she cries and screams, they may intervene. But in truth, they do not care deeply about justice. They just want things to go properly. As long as the market is orderly, does not cause trouble, does not affect the stability of the community, they will accept everything, including turning a woman into a commodity. Sometimes the wife knows this. She understands that the approval of the crowd is the last line of defense if things go wrong. So, she doesn't beg. Her ex-husband doesn't cry to the buyer, but looks straight into the crowd seeking a little justice from the strangers holding the bread. A sympathetic look, a sentence interrupting the sale, enough from somewhere, just that enough to turn the tables. This ambiguity between justice and entertainment, between indifference and protection, is what makes the mob so terrifying. They are not judges, they are public opinion. And in a society where the law does not side with the weak public opinion, is the final law. In some rural areas, the authorities have chosen to remain silent on the practice. Some local judges have argued that interfering with community customs could provoke a backlash. One man was even thrown out of the market when he tried to stop a wife-selling session. In the eyes of the villagers, the judge had no understanding of reality. For them, wife-selling, if it were properly done, was a solution. A form of poor divorce. A way to preserve peace. Something they had done for generations without lawyers or parliament. But there were also officials who secretly supported wife-selling, seeing it as a way to reduce the burden on the locality. Instead of having to support an abandoned wife and her child in a poorhouse or a workhouse, they advised the husband to sell his wife to save trouble. A practice that benefited everyone except the woman. The community is the preserver of tradition, but it is also the burying place of the oldest injustices. A collective can tolerate immorality as long as it does not upset the old order. And in that order, the poor wife, tied around the neck, standing silently in the marketplace, must accept that justice lies not in the hands of the law, but in the indifferent eyes of the onlookers. The crowd is a witness. The crowd is a voice that legitimizes something that should not exist. And the crowd, if it wants to, can also be the only one to help her escape. But that rarely happens. Because in that world, when everyone is used to seeing women being sold, no one feels outrage anymore. No one is born expecting to be sold, especially not a child, who has no idea what poverty rights or loss are. But in the wife markets of 18th and 19th century England, children, the little souls who were supposed to be protected from the storms of adulthood, were sometimes included in the merchandise as accessories to their mothers. And that wasn't considered strange. It was considered realistic. Newspapers of the time recorded that a woman was sold for $100 and that her 2 children were accompanying her, each worth $25. The description was as cold as a cattle sale ledger, with not a single line about the emotions, the looks, the cries of the children. They were counted as assets, as liabilities attached to the main asset. One could sweep the floor, the other could serve tea. That was valuable. There were also markets where mothers were sold away with no one wanting to take their children with them. And in the moment the rope was handed over, the line separating families was broken. Some children were left with their old fathers, some were sent to orphanages, some followed their mothers to a new home, not knowing who their new owners were. All they knew was that they were no longer in their familiar places. The old shirt, the walking stick, the wall covered in charcoal drawings. All were left behind as a part of their childhood that no one bothered to keep. There is no record of what the child really thought, but we can imagine. A 5 or 6-year-old child clinging to his mother's skirt in a crowd of strangers. The cold seeped through his thin clothes, the noise of the crowd frightened him. And while the adults negotiated price and exchanged hands, he could only watch silently. No one asked him if he wanted to go. No one asked if he missed his father. No one asked how he felt knowing that his very presence was a burden that made his mother sell for less. In their new homes, the children had to learn to be quiet. They had to learn not to mention their father's name. They had to learn to forget the old kitchen, the thin soup, or the familiar lullaby. Sometimes they were treated kindly, sometimes they were beaten, ordered around, considered extras that were not needed. And over time, their memories of that market day gradually faded, but the fear remained. Quiet, deep, and only revealed much later as nameless gaps in the hearts of adults. There is a story about a little girl who was sold with her mother at a market in Pontefract in 1847. The buyer, a widowed farmer, agreed to buy them all because he couldn't bear to see the child cry. But the words, while touching, were actually a testament to his coldness. If the child hadn't cried, he would have abandoned her. And for many years afterwards, the girl grew up in a family, without blood ties, calling a stranger her father, and living in a world where the links to the past were severed and no one bothered to mend them. The most tragic thing of all, the children were never called victims. There was no trial for them. No adult took responsibility. They simply went with their mothers, an accessory to the transaction like a bowl in a set of dishes. And the mothers carrying their children were torn between feelings happy to keep them, but also worried about whether they could feed them, protect them, or be thrown out into the street by their new owners if the children cried too much. And so, those children grew up with a vague nostalgia, with nameless doubts, and with gaps in their memories that no one could explain. They did not know that they had been sold, that they had a price, but subconsciously they understood that their lives had been weighed, that they had been decided by the nod of a strange man. When we think about it today, it's easy to think of it as something from a bygone era. But the silent wounds it left behind, the family breakdown, the insecurity, the silence still exist in other forms. And if there's anything that echoes from those markets, it's the silent call of children who were once included in the merchandise but never asked, "Do you agree?" The rope that is tied around a woman's neck, waist, or wrist during a wife-selling ceremony is more than a staging tool. It is not simply a prop for a village market performance. It is a living contract, a silent declaration that the woman no longer belongs to her ex-husband, but is being transferred, with witnesses present, with a community watching, and with the formality of a formal property transfer. At that time, England did not yet have civil courts that dealt with divorce for the poor. The laws were obscure, complicated, and not for the lower classes. So, what the law did not allow, the people created: a version of manual divorce with a rope as evidence. It was passed from the old husband to the new man. And that moment, simple, brief, was the entire process of a marital transfer. In many markets, when the deal is done, the rope is removed from the woman and placed in the hands of her new husband, as if handing over a certificate of ownership. The crowd looks on, nodding. Everyone understands that the transfer is complete. The man from that moment on becomes the legal husband, not by law, but by community standards. And the woman who has never signed any papers has now entered a new chapter in her life without needing court confirmation, if only the rope had been transferred properly. Some wife sales went further. They wrote a deed of sale. It sounds strange, but it was true. Some documents include the words, "I, John Parsons, receive from John Tucker, £6 and 6 shillings, and do sell my wife, Ann Parsons, together with all her rights, liabilities, and services ever rendered by her." The language is reminiscent of cattle trading law, but applied to marriage. Such deed was signed, witnessed, and sometimes retained as a semi-official legal document. After the transaction, many of the newlyweds had a small meal at a nearby pub. There was laughter. There was clinking of beers. There was awkward cheering. Some might have thought they had just attended a special wedding. And in that moment, it was hard to tell what was a rite of liberation and what was a rite of humiliation. Everything was happening on the thin line between power and powerlessness, between hope and resignation. The rope, in this role, is not just a symbol of ownership. It is a tool that legitimizes an act that is illegal in the eyes of the law, but reasonable in the eyes of the community. In an age where marriages cannot be broken up in black and white, the rope is an invisible pen that draws a way out for those who have no other choice. It is both a law and a trace of an unjust system. And more than that, it is evidence that when the law does not serve people, people will create their own law, albeit in a distorted and painful form. But it must be said that not everyone who holds a rope is a bad person. There are new husbands who, after receiving their wives from someone else, immediately remove the rope, without saying anything. Just gently put it aside and hold the woman's hand. That action, though small, carries a wordless kindness. A message. From now on, you don't need to wear a rope to be here. In a world where women are treated like property, just such an action is enough to make people cry. Yet that rope remains a symbol of a dark time. It is a string that binds two people together, not by love, but by social acceptance. It is a testament to a painful truth, that in order to leave a bad marriage, a woman must turn herself into a commodity, endure the scrutiny of the crowd, and let that rope decide her fate. And in the end, no matter who holds it, no matter how it ends, the one who truly loses is the one who wears that rope around her neck. Not every wife-selling session ends with a nod and a change of rope. There are days when the market lasts until dusk, where the woman is sold not once, but 3 times or even more, as if she were a damaged item that is repeatedly returned because the buyer is not satisfied. Such cases are not just anomalies, but tragedies perpetuated by the cynicism, capriciousness, and greed of others. A tragedy that has no climax, only repetition, and each repetition deepens the wound. Imagine a wife. Her name is not recorded. She is described only as strong and good at gardening, being taken to the market by her husband early in the morning, hoping to get it over with and come back for lunch. The first man to make an offer, seemingly a decent one, agrees to buy her for 3 shillings. The transaction is made, the rope is given, the crowd disperses. But a few hours later, the buyer returns saying she's not your type. The reason is vague, like returning a dress that doesn't fit. The wife is strapped again, stands on the platform, again bows again. The crowd turns around, some snickering, some asking, will the price go down this time? A second buyer appeared, a blacksmith, burly and gruff, and agreed to buy her after a few minutes of consideration. Again the transaction was completed. But within an hour, the wife was brought back. this time without explanation. Perhaps he felt cheated. Perhaps he simply wanted to demonstrate his power, that buying a wife could be as undone as buying a wrong. And so, she was sold a third time, this time for a cheaper price with a few sympathetic onlookers. The narrator in the historical document recorded that by the third sale, the woman was trembling, her eyes were lifeless, no longer responding to comments. This was no longer a wife hoping for a new life. This was a person whose dignity was being publicly eroded with no one standing up to stop it, not because they did not feel pain, but because they were used to it. Used to the humiliation that could be wrapped up in a mourning. Used to the value of a person being sold, tested, returned, like a defective item. The market was not only an insult to the woman who was sold, but also a vivid denunciation of the fragility of an entire moral system. When a society allows a person to be sold 3 times in one day without feeling any sense of abnormality, it is no longer a case of the impotence of the law. It is a case of the callousness of conscience. You might ask, why didn't she run away? Why didn't she scream? Why didn't she fight back? But how could she when the whole community was standing around her just to watch, to judge, to bargain? She had nowhere to go, no assets, no relatives willing to take her, and no law on her side. For her, standing in the middle of the market, even 3 times, was better than being dragged back to her old house where her ex-husband could teach her a lesson for daring to leave. The men involved in the trade may not think they are doing anything wrong. They are following the village tradition. They are helping a woman remarry. They are taking on the responsibility of her ex-husband. But in that so-called indifference, women's dignity is crushed bit by bit. Not by sticks or whips, but by indifferent looks, jokes, and acceptance from the crowd. There is no clear ending for the woman in this story. History does not say whether she found a decent home or was swept away into the silence of memory, but the fact that she was sold 3 times in one day is enough to make us understand not everyone is lucky enough to escape the shame. For some, escape is only a repetition of the shame, paved with hope, crushed by rejection. And if you have just felt a pang in your heart, hold on to it. Because the worst thing is not the wife selling that has happened in history, but the indifference that history often shows to those who have been sold so many times that no one remembers their names. If there was one thing that pervaded the entire century, the century of wife-selling markets of ropes, of resigned glances, it was silence. Not the silence of someone who chooses to endure, but a silence that is forced, a silence that seeps into the blood, into the skin, into the gaze. The silence of a woman, not only when standing in the middle of the market, but also when lying in the dark kitchen, when hearing the footsteps of her drunken husband returning, when the child is beaten, when the last coin is thrown into the pub instead of buying milk. It is a silence that is structured, shaped, protected by the legal system, by social morality, by a seemingly benevolent community. She was not allowed to speak because the law did not recognize her voice. She was not allowed to protest because no one thought she had a choice. She was not allowed to leave because no one wrote the law to allow it. And when all the doors were slammed shut, the rope and the village market became a strange escape. But even when she was bought transferred, she did not speak, because the shame had long since choked her voice. The system, not the harsh laws on paper, but the intricate combination of traditions, morals, expectations, and gender roles, keeps women not just physically controlled, but mentally bound. Even when no one is holding a knife to their throats, they feel powerless to fight back, because they have been convinced that they have no value apart from themselves, that their bodies, their voices, their lives are not important enough to protect. And so, we rarely read the women's side of the story. Most accounts come from newspapers, from men, from lawyers, from observers. But there are no diaries from Mary, no letters from Sarah, no accounts from those who were taken from their husbands, their children, their names, because they were never asked. And when they weren't asked, they learned not to answer. They learned silence as a survival skill. A few words escaped from that veil of silence, rare ones recorded by eyewitnesses. I want to be sold. I want to change. Or, I chose him. Not because I love him, but because I can't stand my ex anymore. Those words rang out like bells in the fog. No one was sure who heard them, but those who did heard them found them hard to forget. They weren't rhetoric, they weren't romantic. They were simply the will to live expressed in a few words, trembling but firm. The system has tried to make them disappear from history by writing them as objects, as commodities that can be bought, sold, returned. But that has made them more present in memory. The more newspapers describe them as objects, the more future generations will ask, who were the people in them? What did they feel? What did they think when they were seen as objects? And it is from these questions that the stolen voices begin to be recovered, not from them, but from the compassion of posterity. By the time the legal reforms of the late 19th century came, allowing women to own property, file for divorce, receive fairer justice, the women who once stood in the marketplace with the rope around their necks were old or dead. They did not enjoy the fruits of the change their humiliation had helped bring about. They received no apologies, no compensation, no honor. But they left behind a lesson that human rights are not automatic. They are the result of suffering, of silent resistance, and of pain that spans generations. Their silence is not acceptance. It is a silent accusation. And it is that silence, persistent clinging to the pages of history, that we cannot ignore. The markets have ended. The rope fell to the cold stone floor more than a century ago. But if today we close our eyes to injustice, if we remain silent to someone's unspoken cry for help, then we are extending the old rope, thickening the shadow of the law that once buried them.